May 21st, 2010, 68-year-old Dennis Kola sat down for breakfast with his wife Myrna inside of their kitchen in their spacious 4-bedroom house in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Dennis picked up the newspaper and, like always, began reading the front page out loud to Myrna. This was an activity the couple enjoyed doing together every morning. According to the story on the front page, the stock market was struggling and unemployment was on the rise. But Myrna didn't bat an eye. She knew that she and Dennis would be fine because they had made a ton of money throughout their 42-year marriage by owning multiple successful businesses, from a chain of pharmacies to a Ford car dealership that Dennis owned with his son. But a few years earlier, Dennis had seen the writing on the wall when it came to the country's economy. So he had sold his businesses before things got too bad, and he had walked away with enough money for him and Myrna to be set for the rest of their lives without having to work. But the truth was, Dennis and Myrna actually loved to work, kind of independent of making money, so they weren't quite ready to just full-on retire. And so after selling his companies, Dennis had returned to his old job as a pharmacist, and Myrna worked at a local middle school as a substitute teacher. And so on this Friday morning, because of his work commitments, Dennis didn't have time to read beyond just the first few pages of the newspaper. After putting the paper down, Dennis finished his breakfast, then gave his wife a kiss on the cheek and told her he loved her, and then he walked out the front door. Once outside, Dennis climbed into his truck and began the 40-mile drive to the nearby town where he worked at this local pharmacy. And while Dennis made his commute, Myrna cleaned up the kitchen and then headed out to work herself. And as she drove the short distance to West Salem Middle School, she passed by all these mini mansions that were just like hers, with wide, well-manicured lawns, and then she drove by the neighborhood golf course and banquet hall. Myrna couldn't picture a better place for her and Dennis to grow old together, a small community filled with friends where she always felt comfortable and safe. And she loved how close her neighborhood was to the rest of her family. Dennis and Myrna had 2 grown children who also had children of their own, and Myrna thought there was nothing better than having the family over and spending time with the grandkids she adored. Myrna finally arrived at the middle school, and she went inside and walked down a long hall to the classroom where she had been assigned that day. She opened the door, and the faces of the students lit up. Myrna was the kids' favorite substitute teacher. The school day passed quickly for Myrna, and as always, she made each period pass just as quickly for her students by making sure the lessons were actually fun. Myrna had always believed that learning should be an enjoyable experience and not a slog where every minute feels like an hour. Myrna worked that day at the school until around 3 p.m., and then the final bell rang, and she told her class to have a great weekend, and she said she'd be back as their substitute on Monday. Then Myrna headed outside, hopped in her car, and made her way home, and then once there, she did some chores around the house, and when she was done with her housework, she sat down in the home office and logged onto her computer. About 45 minutes later, around 6 p.m., her husband, Dennis, pulled back up to the house after his day of work. He parked his truck and made his way onto the porch, eager to get inside and have dinner with his wife. Dennis opened the door and walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, his keys dangling from his hand, and then Dennis stepped into the kitchen and called out to his wife. And then suddenly, everything went black. Three days later, on Monday at 7:50 a.m., the morning bell rang at West Salem Middle School, marking the beginning of the official day. Students all took their seats in all the classrooms, and the school kind of went quiet as the teachers began their lessons. That is, in every classroom but one. In that one classroom, the chair behind the teacher's desk remained empty, and so the students in that classroom just remained standing up and chatting with each other, aware of the fact that their teacher was not there, but not that worried because they liked having some extra time. However, these students' obvious restlessness caught the ear of an administrator who happened to be walking by the classroom. And the administrator stepped into the room and asked what was going on, and the students said their substitute teacher still hadn't shown up. Concerned, the administrator told the students to wait quietly, and then he returned to the front office to double-check the schedule. This was the class that Myrna Kola had been assigned to teach that week, and apparently she had just not shown up for work and didn't tell anybody. The administrator pulled up Myrna's file and dialed her phone number, but no one answered. So the administrator checked Myrna's emergency contact info, and he found it was her son, Eric. Eric Kola was home with his wife when he got the phone call from the administrator. Eric told the administrator that he had no idea why his mom wouldn't show up for work, but he told him he'd try to get in touch with her and report back as soon as he could. Eric hung up and dialed his mom's cell phone, but it just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. So Eric called his father, who at this point in the morning would have been in his truck on his way to work, and so in theory would have been ready to receive a phone call, but he too did not answer his phone. After both parents didn't pick up, Eric turned to his wife, looking concerned, and said something wasn't right, that this was totally out of character for his parents to just go completely incommunicado. And so Eric called his sister, Cindy, and asked her if she had had any contact with their parents, but Cindy said that she hadn't talked to them since before the weekend. After Eric ended this call, he told his wife that he was just going to go to his parents' house to see what the heck was going on. And about 10 minutes later, Eric slowed his truck to a stop in front of the house, and he saw his dad's truck was out front. Eric parked, walked up the driveway to the side of the house, and he looked into his parents' 3-car garage. And he could see his mother's car, a Mountaineer, was also parked inside, so his parents had to be home. Eric opened the garage with the opener his parents had given him, he walked past his mother's SUV, and then he opened the unlocked door to the house and stepped inside. And as he walked towards the kitchen, he saw his father. Dennis was lying there, motionless on the kitchen floor. Eric ran to his father, and he saw there was a pool of blood all around him. Eric got down on the floor and grabbed his dad's leg, desperately trying to shake him awake. But not only was Dennis unresponsive, his body was totally stiff. And so in a panic, Eric grabbed his phone and dialed 911, and when the operator answered, he told them as best as he could what he had seen, and the operator, who was very calm, asked Eric if anyone else was in the house. And so Eric, who didn't know, began walking down the hall, and when he looked into the office, he cried out. There was his mother, slumped over the desk at the computer. Her skin had turned purple. The operator calmly asked Eric if his mother was still breathing, and Eric replied that no, she wasn't, that both of his parents had to be dead. A little while after Eric's 911 call, Agent John Christopherson of the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation and members of his team arrived at the Colas house. Christopherson saw 2 deputies from the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department talking to Eric in the front yard. And he saw several of the Colas neighbors standing on their porches, looking completely stunned by all the police activity. I mean, this stuff didn't happen in this neighborhood. Christopherson knew major crime was rare in this community, and a double homicide was basically unheard of. That was a big reason Christopherson and the state police had been brought in to lead this investigation. Agent Christopherson got out of his car, walked across the yard, and introduced himself to the deputies and to Eric. And he let them both know that he'd be back soon to ask some questions. Then he led members of his team into the Colas house. The smell of decomposing bodies hit them immediately, and the smell instantly told them that the victims must have been dead for quite a while. Christopherson walked to the kitchen, and he saw Dennis lying face down on the floor. Dennis was surrounded by a pool of coagulated blood, and he had a hole in the right side of his head. Dennis was still wearing his jacket, and his car keys were clutched tightly in his hand. So Christopherson figured that Dennis must have been shot shortly after he walked through the front door of his house. After looking around the kitchen, Christopherson walked down the hall to the office, where he knew the second victim had been found. He saw Myrna's body hunched over the desk. She had an obvious bullet wound in the back of her head, and her left arm was resting on the computer keyboard, as if she had been typing when someone walked up behind her and shot her. Christopherson turned around and glanced back at the office door. He wondered if the killer had stood there and watched this woman at her computer before shooting her. There was something cold-blooded about the idea, like a predator observing its prey before moving in for the kill. While Christopherson searched the office, a member of the investigative team walked inside and told Christopherson that he needed to see something upstairs. So Christopherson followed the officer up a carpeted staircase, down a hallway, and into Myrna and Dennis's bedroom. It appeared like the room had been ransacked. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, but as Christopherson walked across the room to the dresser, he felt like there was something unusual about the bedroom scene. Their dresser drawers had all been pulled out and left open in a way that a robber wouldn't have actually been able to see what was in each drawer, and it didn't look like anyone had actually dug through the drawers or taken anything. So Christopherson wondered if maybe the killer had tried to stage the room to look like a robbery, even though that's not what it was. Christopherson continued to walk around the room, and he quickly found pieces of Myrna's very expensive jewelry just sitting out, untouched, so that only added to his suspicion that the apparent ransacking in the bedroom really had been staged. Christopherson finished searching the room, and then made his way down the hall to an upstairs guest room. This room looked untouched. But then, when he opened the door to a walk-in closet inside of this room, something immediately caught the agent's eye. It was a .22 caliber rifle propped up against the wall. Christopherson looked up, and he saw, on a shelf right above the rifle, was an opened box of ammunition. He kneeled down to look closer at the rifle, and he noticed there was an indentation in the carpet nearby that was about the same size and shape as the butt of the gun. It looked like the indentation was where the rifle had been resting, but then just recently, someone must have moved that rifle, and when they returned it, they didn't put it back exactly where they'd found it, in the indentation. Christofferson had a member of his team bag the rifle and the box of ammunition and book them into evidence. Then Christofferson headed downstairs and outside and joined the deputies who were talking to Eric. After telling Eric how sorry he was for his loss, Christofferson said, "Look, I have to ask you right now about what you know, because this is a murder investigation and this needs to move quickly." And so he asked Eric when was the last time he saw his parents alive. Eric said it had been Thursday night, so 4 nights earlier. He had stopped by the house to help his mother do laundry and to help his father replace some boards out on the deck. And before Eric left, Eric told Christofferson that his father had said to him, "I love you, son." And Eric had said back, "Yeah, I love you too, Dad." He said that was the last time they actually spoke. Eric did tell Christofferson that weekend he had tried calling his parents to invite them to a cookout, but they didn't pick up, so he left a voicemail, and his parents didn't call him back, but he didn't think it was that big of a deal because he knew his parents had plans with friends that weekend. After hearing this, Christofferson asked Eric if he knew of anyone who might have access to his parents' residence. Eric said he couldn't think of anyone specifically, but he did say his parents often kept their doors unlocked. This didn't really surprise Christofferson because that's how safe this community was. But now he wondered if maybe someone had exploited that sense of security and just slipped inside the house through an unlocked door. As Eric continued to speak with Christofferson and the other police officers, Eric's sister, Cindy Cowell, arrived at the property. And as she walked across the yard towards them, Christofferson could tell she'd been crying. After Cindy walked over to them, she gave her brother a hug, and the two of them did their best to comfort each other and also to provide any additional information that might help. But neither of them could think of anyone who might have had a motive to kill their parents. And so this double murder was turning into a total mystery. The next day, the medical examiner performed autopsies on Dennis and Myrna, and the results were far from surprising. Each had been shot in the head. But there was an important detail. The bullet that had struck them in the head was a .22 caliber bullet. And this was an important detail for Christofferson because it was the same caliber bullet used in the rifle he'd found in the upstairs bedroom closet. And that rifle had clearly been recently moved because of that indentation he saw in the carpet. And Christofferson thought that if that rifle was the murder weapon, then the killer had to have known Dennis and Myrna well enough to know where they kept that gun. Christofferson wanted to develop a timeline of the Colas' last day. However, the autopsies did not pinpoint the exact times of their deaths, so he still wasn't even sure what day they had died. But one thing he did know was that Myrna had clearly been using her computer when she was killed, so his team sent Myrna's computer to a forensic data lab where the hard drive could be analyzed for timestamps. And this data revealed that Myrna had begun using her computer at exactly 5:14 p.m. on Friday, May 21st, and her very last keystroke was made at 5:41 p.m. that same evening. And so Christofferson believed that 5:41 p.m. on May 21st was the exact time of Myrna's death. Then Christofferson, using this information, figured out when Dennis had left work on that day and how long generally it would take Dennis to drive back home. And based on this, Christofferson concluded that Dennis most likely got home around 6 p.m. So he estimated that Dennis's time of death was about 20 minutes after his wife's death. So at this point, Christofferson knew that the Colas had very likely been killed in the early evening of May 21st, 3 days before they were actually discovered. And also, based on the timeline, whoever had shot Myrna had very likely waited inside of the house to then kill Dennis when he walked inside. Christofferson knew that Dennis and Myrna were well off financially, and they had multiple investments and life insurance policies with very big payouts, so money had to be considered as a potential motive. And investigators soon learned that the beneficiaries of Dennis and Myrna's life insurance policies were their kids, Eric and Cindy, and they stood to inherit over $700,000 each. And so obviously when you include the fact that Eric was the one who found the bodies, this made the kids highly suspicious. And so Christofferson decided he would speak to them both, but he would start with Eric. And so the day after the discovery of the bodies, Eric was, how was his relationship with his parents? Eric said he had always gotten along with both of his parents. He said his father was a great business partner because they worked at that car dealership together, and also they played golf together all the time. Eric said he also made a point to see his mother as much as he could and also help her out around the house because she refused to slow down even though she was almost 70. After that, Kristofferson asked Eric to walk him through what he did all day on Friday, May 21st, which is again the day that Kristofferson believed the two victims were killed. Eric said that day he spent the morning and afternoon doing what he normally did, day trading. Day trading is a form of securities trading where the trader buys stocks and other assets and then sells them the same day, taking advantage of price fluctuations that occur between the opening and closing of the trading day. And Eric would say he was actually a pretty successful day trader, often pulling in between $7,000 and $10,000 a month. The only downside being that it required him to sit at home on his computer for hours and hours on end. After he finally got up from his computer, he left his house to meet up with his friend to help grout and tile a shower. He said he was with that friend until about 5:30 p.m., and then he went to pick up his wife at home because they were going out to celebrate their 16th wedding anniversary. Now, to this point in the interview, it was very cut and dry. Eric is doing his best to be composed, but at this point, Eric just suddenly shook his head and began laughing. Kristofferson was very surprised at this and asked, did I miss something funny? Eric stopped laughing and said, it's not really funny, but I had known about this day, our anniversary, for a long time. We had planned it all out. But as I was going back home that day, I actually realized I totally forgot to buy an actual anniversary gift. And so Eric would explain that he stopped at a retail store called Shopko to buy his wife a hanging plant because he knew his wife loved hanging plants, and he also knew the exact type to get her. And so Eric said he went inside the shop and he browsed the store's garden center for a while, but he didn't actually see the plant that his wife liked. So he drove to a different Shopko location, and he did find the right hanging plant there. And he paid for it, and then drove home, and then he and his wife had gone out for their celebration. And then right after he said that, Eric looked like he had just remembered something out of the blue. And he pulled his wallet out, and he took out a receipt for this plant, and he slid it across the table to Kristofferson, saying that he had held on to this receipt in case his wife didn't like the plant, and so she could return it. Kristofferson looked at the receipt, and it did confirm that Eric had bought this plant at 6:15 p.m. at the Shopko. After that, Kristofferson asked Eric to wait in the interview room while he reached out to Eric's friend to confirm that they really had met up on that Friday to grout and tile the bathroom. And so Kristofferson got the friend's number, stepped into the hall, and gave him a call, and the friend confirmed that Eric had left his house around 5:30 that evening. And so at this point, Kristofferson concluded that based on Eric's timeline, he didn't really have enough time to have also driven to his parents' house to kill them, between leaving his friend's house and then getting that plant at Shopko. So Kristofferson did not think Eric was as likely of a suspect as he originally seemed. So Kristofferson walked back into the interview room and asked Eric if he could think of anyone at all, who may have had a reason to harm his parents. Eric hesitated, and then with obvious reluctance in his voice, he said they should look into his sister, Cindy, and her husband, Patrick. When asked to explain why, Eric said that Cindy had been having some very serious financial problems. She was living paycheck to paycheck, earning close to minimum wage, working for a collections agency. Meanwhile, her husband, Patrick, didn't work at all. They had a mortgage and other expenses, and Cindy had been borrowing money from their parents to help make ends meet. In fact, she actually owed her parents tens of thousands of dollars. And then also, Eric said that his sister's husband, Patrick, was just generally kind of a bad guy. And also, Eric knew his parents did not like Patrick at all and often referred to him as a, quote, lazy bum. But Eric said he wasn't sure if his parents even knew just how bad things really were between Cindy and her husband, Patrick. Eric said Patrick had a violent temper and had once pulled a gun on Cindy after she threatened to leave him. Patrick allegedly told Cindy that the only way she'd be leaving him was in a body bag. Kristofferson was shocked at this information. If this was true, this was a huge red flag. The idea that Patrick had literally pulled a gun out and actually threatened to kill someone certainly made him a pretty big suspect. But Kristofferson kind of tempered his reaction to this and just thanked Eric for coming in and speaking to him. And then after Eric was gone, Kristofferson immediately reached out to Cindy to set up a meeting. The following day, Cindy showed up at the station and joined Kristofferson in the interview room. And right away, Kristofferson could tell Cindy seemed very rattled and sort of nervous. But Kristofferson didn't react to that and just thanked her for coming in and reiterated how sorry he was for her loss. His voice was calm and friendly, and he told Cindy there was no reason to be nervous. This was just an interview, not an interrogation. Cindy nodded, but still seemed very nervous. Kristofferson began the interview by asking Cindy when was the last time she spoke to her parents. And Cindy said she had spoken to her father on Friday morning, so the day that Dennis and Myrna were killed. Cindy said during this conversation with her dad, she had talked about her and her husband's mounting financial troubles. She had told her father that she and Patrick had absolutely no money, and to make matters worse, the unemployment check that Patrick was expecting hadn't arrived yet. Cindy said her father had been sort of blunt with her that morning. He criticized her husband for not supporting her and their daughter, and then he told Cindy he would not keep giving her any more money. Cindy looked like she was about to cry. She told Christofferson that her father's rejection was so upsetting for her, and she felt like Eric was the favorite child, the golden boy, while she was just a disappointment to her parents. After that, Christofferson asked her what she had done the rest of that day after she had spoken to her father. Cindy said she'd been at work until about 4:45 p.m. She left the office and stopped at a convenience store to buy some groceries, and then she got home between 5:30 and 6. And once she was home, she spent the rest of the evening with her daughter and husband. Christofferson took down Cindy's work information and said that was all he needed from her for now, and that he would follow up if necessary. After the interview, members of the investigative team went to Cindy's office and obtained her punch cards. And the punch cards would show that yes, Cindy had clocked out at 4:45 p.m. Next, they drove over to the convenience store where Cindy said she had done her grocery shopping, and the manager of that store gave them access to the surveillance footage from that day, and it didn't take investigators long to find Cindy in the video, shopping in the store during the time frame she said she was. And so, just like with her brother, the investigators concluded that basically based on the timeline, there wasn't enough time for Cindy to have gone to her parents' house and killed them. But Agent Christofferson couldn't completely rule Cindy out yet. Even if she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, what's to say her husband, Patrick, the man who apparently had, a temper and had previously drawn a gun on Cindy and threatened her life, who's to say he didn't pull the trigger? And also maybe Cindy was involved somehow with the murder, that she helped coordinate it for Patrick. But before Christofferson jumped to that conclusion and brought Patrick in and really drilled him hard on what he was doing on that day, he first wanted to check to see if Eric's description of Patrick was actually accurate. And what Christofferson learned was Patrick had apparently cheated on Cindy at some point, he abused drugs, and he had difficulty holding down jobs. And because he was currently unemployed, he had a lot of free time and not a lot of money. Christofferson also learned that Myrna did not like Patrick so much that she had warned Cindy that if she stayed married to Patrick, there's a chance that she would just deny her getting her inheritance, that basically Patrick could not touch this money, and that was the reason she wouldn't be getting it. And Patrick was definitely aware of this, and also he was aware that Cindy's parents were apparently about to cut them both off financially. And so it did seem like Patrick had more motive to want Dennis and Myrna dead than anybody else. A few days after the murders, Christofferson, along with an investigator from the sheriff's department, waited for Patrick inside of an interview room. Eventually, another officer led Patrick into the room, and Patrick sat down on the other side of the table. Patrick was very physically imposing. He was tall with broad shoulders, and he had short cropped hair, and he had spent some time in the Marine Corps. But once he was settled in his seat, he made it very clear that he wanted to help the investigators in any way he could. And the investigators actually couldn't help but look at each other really quickly, like they couldn't believe how soft-spoken Patrick seemed. I mean, this guy had this horrible reputation, and right now, he seemed like he was just very cooperative. But Christofferson knew looks can be deceiving, so he got right to the point, and he asked Patrick how he spent his day on Friday, May 21st, the day his in-laws were killed. And Patrick said in a very soft voice that he had spent the day just kind of hanging around the house by himself, watching TV and playing Xbox. After this, the county investigator said to Patrick, that's not exactly an airtight alibi. If he was home by himself, how could anybody corroborate that? Patrick said he understood, but he really was telling the truth. That's what he did on Friday. And then he also said he always had a great relationship with Dennis and Myrna, and he would never do anything to hurt them or to cause his wife any pain. At this point, Christofferson was nearly certain that Patrick was just lying, because basically everyone they had spoken to had said that the in-laws did not get along with Patrick. They called him the lazy bum, and they totally resented him and did not like him. So how could he possibly have a good relationship with them? And so Christofferson didn't waste any time. He leaned in and told Patrick that police had heard his relationship with the victims had been strained, to say the least, and so it seemed very likely that right now Patrick was lying. Christofferson also pointed out Patrick's weak alibi and the fact that as a former Marine, he would know how to use a gun. Patrick didn't deny any of this and said he did own several firearms, but he said again that he really had been at home playing video games that past Friday, and he really didn't have anything to do with the murders. Christofferson told Patrick that they might have a better idea if he really was telling the truth if he allowed them to search his house. Patrick looked at both investigators, and his voice stayed calm and soft like it had the whole time, and he said yes, he would consent to a search of his home because he had nothing to hide. So not long after this interview, investigators did search Patrick and Cindy's house, and they would find multiple firearms which were confiscated. They also seized Patrick's Xbox and brought it into the crime lab for analysis. Investigators were able to see exactly when the Xbox game console was being used, and it did seem to confirm everything Patrick had said, because the Xbox had been used all day on Friday, suggesting Patrick really had been at home playing video games at the time Myrna and Dennis were murdered. And also, after closer analysis, the guns seized in Patrick and Cindy's house were not the same ones that fired the .22 caliber bullets that killed Dennis and Myrna. And so, just like Eric and Cindy, Patrick suddenly had a solid alibi. The following day, Eric walked outside of his house, he opened up his mailbox, and he found a single item inside. It was a plain white envelope with no postage on it. Eric took the envelope inside of his house, he opened it up, and he looked at the paper that was inside. And when Eric saw what was on it, his face turned pale and he started breathing heavily. His wife walked into the room and saw Eric staring at this note and clenching his jaw and shaking his head, and she asked him, "What's going on? What does the note say?" Eric walked over to his wife and just held the note out for her to read. And in strange, weirdly stilted handwriting were the words, "Fixed you." That's all it said, "Fixed you." Eric's wife immediately picked up her phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the house and took this strange note into evidence. And also the deputy noticed that Eric was incredibly rattled and could barely talk. In fact, the sheriff's deputy said it seemed like Eric could actually have a heart attack. And as Eric tried to catch his breath, he would tell the deputy that he believed his parents' killer wrote this note, and somehow those two words, "fixed you," meant they were coming for him and his family next. The note forced Christofferson to view this case from a totally new angle. If somebody really did have a vendetta against the Colas, and that's why they killed Dennis and Myrna, it did seem entirely possible that they might also target the rest of the Cola family. And so that possibility obviously put way more pressure on Christofferson and his team to solve this case quickly. But the only thing that Christofferson kept coming back to that just seemed like it had to be at the heart of this case was money. Not only did Dennis and Myrna have property, investments, and huge insurance policies before they died, but also Eric had been a successful day trader and had lots of money too. So Christofferson decided he would dig deep as he could into the family's finances, hoping that might point him to a potential killer. And so back at the station, Christofferson and a forensic accountant dug through stacks of Dennis and Myrna's printed bank statements, and also they reviewed the couple's most recent online banking transactions. And as they looked at that recent online activity, something absolutely shocked them. And at first, Christofferson literally couldn't believe what he was looking at, like this had to be a mistake, because it was something so outlandish, it just shouldn't have been there. There was a transaction made on May 22nd, 2010, the day after the murders. The transaction showed a check that was cashed from Dennis's account for $50,000. Now, the name on the signature line of the check was Dennis Cola, but it was the name on the account that this check had been deposited into that really caught the investigators' attention. And suddenly, the whole focus of the investigation shifted. Police immediately served a search warrant on this particular person's house, and inside they found a pair of plain white envelopes very similar to the envelope that Eric had found in his mailbox that contained the words "fixed you" on it. And when those envelopes were compared to the one that Eric had received, they contained the same manufacturing defect, proving that the envelope containing that "fixed you" note had come from this individual's house. Then a forensic document examiner looked at that $50,000 check, and he quickly determined that Dennis's signature on this check was a forgery. What's more, the forged handwriting perfectly matched the handwriting on the "fixed you" note. And so now Agent Christofferson was very confident that the person who wrote that note, killer, who was inside of the Cola's house at this point, slowly walked down the hallway in the direction of the home office. They watched Myrna from the hall until they were sure she was totally preoccupied with what she was doing on her computer. Then the killer slowly walked upstairs, entered one of the bedrooms, opened the closet door, and lifted the .22 caliber rifle from where it was resting on the floor. They also reached up and grabbed some ammo from the box on the shelf, then loaded the rifle and walked back downstairs. Then the killer made their way back to the home office, and they looked inside and saw Myrna was still preoccupied with the computer. And so the killer stepped forward into the room, they raised the rifle, aimed it at Myrna's head, and then pulled the trigger. A .22 caliber bullet lodged in Myrna's brain. She died instantly, slumping over her computer, with her fingers still near the last keys she had pressed. Confident that Myrna was dead, the killer crossed the room and closed the blinds. Then they walked back into the hallway, went down to the kitchen, and sat down at the table, and began to wait. About 20 minutes later, the killer heard Dennis's truck pull up outside. The killer heard the sound of the truck door opening and closing, and then the sounds of footsteps getting louder as Dennis approached the front of the house. At this point, the killer slowly got up and moved towards the back of the kitchen and put their back against the wall, sort of out of view, and continued to wait. A moment later, the killer heard Dennis's footsteps now inside of the house, his keys jangling in his hand. Then the killer saw Dennis walk into the kitchen, and immediately they raised their rifle, aimed it at Dennis's head, and fired. Dennis was dead before he even hit the ground. The killer stared at the body on the floor, and then walked back upstairs and returned the rifle to the closet, failing to notice they were not placing it in the exact spot where it had been before. After that, the killer walked to Dennis and Myrna's bedroom and opened up the dresser drawers to make it look like the home had been robbed. Then the killer opened up the drawer on the nightstand, tore out a check from Dennis's checkbook, and then wrote themselves a $50,000 check and forged Dennis's signature. The killer slipped the check into their pocket, walked back downstairs, left the house, and drove to a Shopko store to buy a hanging plant for an anniversary gift, making sure to keep the receipt to help corroborate the alibi they knew they would need. Dennis and Myrna's own son, Eric Kola, had been their killer. It would turn out Eric had only visited one Shopko store that day to buy a plant, not the two stores like he had told police. And so when detectives obtained the surveillance footage from the Shopko Eric claimed to have visited first, before going to the second one and buying the plant, well, they expected to see him browsing the garden center in this first shop, but the investigators spent hours and hours reviewing the footage from multiple cameras inside and outside the store, but there was no trace of Eric anywhere. And investigators knew that if he had not gone to that store and only went to the second one, well, he would easily have enough time to kill his parents, and so his alibi began to fall apart. And then, when investigators delved deeper into the Kola's financial records, they found that forged $50,000 check, and it was made out to Eric. And then also, when investigators began probing Eric's personal finances, they quickly discovered that Eric had been lying to them. Eric was not raking in $7,000 to $10,000 a month from day trading as he claimed. In fact, he was in serious financial trouble. His day trading had been successful in the beginning, but then the economy had tanked, and Eric's financial position plummeted, leaving him desperately broke and $150,000 in debt. But Eric continued keeping up appearances. He drove luxury cars, spoiled his kids, and retained membership at an exclusive country club. He presented himself to friends as this financial wizard, but all the while, he was actually borrowing huge sums of money from his father and then losing it on the stock market. Investigators had learned from Dennis's colleagues that Dennis was an extraordinarily generous man, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back if he thought you were in need. But Dennis's generosity had its limits. He had reached the end of his rope with his kids because he had given Eric hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he had helped pay Cindy's mortgage while her husband sat at home unemployed playing video games. And in fact, only days before the murders, Dennis had told a work colleague at the pharmacy that he was officially cutting off his children financially. Enough was enough. When police confronted Eric about the forged $50,000 check, Eric explained that his father had given him a blank check the day before he was killed, and Eric had deposited it on Saturday, having no idea his parents were dead. But police didn't believe that, because Dennis had just told his colleague that he planned to stop giving his children money. So police searched Eric's home, and they found the envelopes that matched the envelope from the Fixed You note. Eric had written that note himself and put it in his own mailbox. And so by this point, police were very sure Eric had killed his parents, and they had enough probable cause to arrest him. Police believe Eric Kola murdered his mother and father just so he could use the inheritance money to pull himself out of debt. The case against Eric was entirely circumstantial, but it was strong enough that a jury found him guilty on 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Eric did not receive a dime of his parents' estate, but his 2 children did inherit $740,000, which they split between them. Eric continues to maintain his innocence. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that point, the 13 crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers, which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row, and they had 2 levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via 2 small elevators that could barely fit 1 person inside of them in the back of the aircraft. And down on this lower level was a full-size kitchen, which had ovens and refrigerators, and also at the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying experience. Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit, which is the very front of the plane where the pilots fly the plane, and he had sat down in the customary captain's seat, which was the front left seat. And then after he had sat down, his 10 years younger first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockstill, had joined him in the cockpit and sat down in the customary co-pilot seat, which was directly to the right of Captain Bob. And so after the pilot and co-pilot were both seated, the remaining 2 members of that night's cockpit crew came into the cockpit. Now, normally in most passenger jets, there were only 2 seats in the cockpit, but because L-1011 planes were so massive, there were 4 seats in the cockpit. And so one of the last 2 men who joined the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, who was the flight's engineer. And despite him being this big, strong ox of a man, he was actually known as being fairly soft-spoken and very approachable. And so Don came into the cockpit, he said hello, and then he sat down in the seat right behind the co-pilot, Bert. And then a few seconds after Don, the last man came into the cockpit. It was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo. Angelo was not actually part of that night's flight crew. However, he was an employee of Eastern Airlines, and that night he needed to get to Miami, and so the company had put him on Flight 401 and sat him in the 4th and final seat in the cockpit right behind Captain Bob. Around 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks had been completed, all passengers were seated, as was the crew, and so Captain Bob began taxiing over to the runway. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward and the plane began to take off. A few minutes later, and Flight 401 was airborne up in the night sky over New York, headed south towards Miami. For the next 2 hours, this flight was completely normal. In fact, it was so normal that one of the passengers, named Jerry Escow, actually wrote a letter while he was on the plane telling Eastern Airlines how great their airline was and how smooth this flight was. His plan was, once they landed, to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines. But at 11:32 p.m., so 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this flight would go from being very routine and normal to being anything but. At 11:32 p.m., Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport, but when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed they had a problem. L-1011 jets, like 401, have 3 pieces of landing gear. They have wheels that come down under the left wing, they have wheels that come down under the right wing, and they have wheels that pop out of the nose of the plane. And each of these pieces of landing gear has a corresponding little light bulb, a green light bulb, inside the cockpit that once that piece of landing gear comes down and locks in place and is ready to be landed on, its green light will go on inside of the cockpit. But when Captain Bob lowered their landing gear, his co-pilot, Bert, noticed only 2 of the lights came on. The one that did not light up was the nose landing gear. Now, Captain Bob and the other men in the cockpit, when they saw this issue, they immediately assumed it had to be the light bulb itself that was faulty, not the actual nose landing gear, because this plane was brand new, it had been checked before they left, so the likelihood of the nose landing gear being faulty was incredibly slim. And so Captain Bob, while maintaining his approach towards Miami International, he retracted the landing gear, and then once it had come back into the plane, he just lowered it again, thinking this time all 3 lights would come on. But once again, once the landing gear was deployed the second time, still the nose landing gear light did not come on. And so frustrated, Captain Bob hopped on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and told them that he could not confirm his landing gear was actually safe to land on, and so they would have to circle around for a bit in the sky and get it figured out. And so Miami Air Traffic Control acknowledged what Captain Bob said and then directed Captain Bob to fly out over the nearby Everglades, which is a massive wetlands area in Florida, and to stay out over the Everglades away from other traffic until they fixed the problem. And so once Flight 401 was out over the Everglades flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot so that it would maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. And so once the plane was all set, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began fiddling with this front nose gear indicator light bulb, which they were convinced was faulty. And so they started by pressing on the light, and when that didn't work, they began twisting it, and when that didn't work, they actually pulled the light bulb off the panel and kind of blew the dirt and grime off of it, and then they jammed it back into the panel, but as soon as they did, not only did it not go back on, but they realized they had put it in sideways, and so they couldn't actually get it out again. And so now they're thinking, this light's not going to go on at all, we need to find another way to make sure the nose landing gear has come down. And so Captain Bob at this point is totally frustrated, and so he turns around and he looks at Don Repo, the flight engineer who's sitting right behind the co-pilot, and he tells Don to go down into the hellhole and directly inspect the front landing gear himself. So the hellhole is a space right below the cockpit, and the way you get to it is through a trap door in the floor in the center of the cockpit. And then once down in the hellhole, there is this window that looks straight towards the front of the aircraft where you could look out and actually see the front landing gear and you could make sure it was down or not. And so Don Repo, he gets out of his seat and he opens up the hellhole trap door and he makes his way down below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a 43-year-old man named Robert Marquise, along with a friend of his, were looking for frogs in the Everglades, riding around on Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottom boat with this huge fan on the back of it that propels it forward. It's popular in the Everglades because the water depth is so shallow. At points in the Everglades, the water's only a couple of inches deep. And so all around these two guys, it is totally pitch black out. There are no buildings or people for miles and miles and miles. Their only light source is Robert's headlamp. And so at some point, Robert turns off the airboat and he and his friend are just standing in the middle of it, kind of scanning around on either side. And all around them, they can hear the sound of alligators growling and snakes and frogs moving about the tall grass. And as they're just kind of silently looking around them, out of the corner of Robert's eye, he sees something. And so he looks up right as he sees this huge orange and yellow flash that kind of came out of the ground roughly 5 miles away from where they were. And basically, as soon as Robert saw it, this flash dissipated and it was just totally gone. And so he turned to his friend who had not seen this flash. And Robert said, "Hey, let's go investigate. Let's see what that was." And so Robert fired up his boat again and he began flying across the Everglades straight in the direction where he saw this flash. And after 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per hour across this dark expanse, they reached the area where this flash had been, and Robert and his friend, they just could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside of Flight 401, when Captain Bob turned around in his seat to tell the flight engineer, Don Repo, to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that Captain Bob nudged the steering wheel with his leg. And this little nudge was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, which sent the plane into a gradual descent. But nobody noticed. because, one, it was totally pitch black outside. The Everglades below them, there's no lights, there's nothing, and there was no moon that night. And so when they're looking out the window, there would have been no visual cues that they were going down, up, or anything. It just would have looked like a total void outside. And two, the descent they were now suddenly in was so gradual, it would not have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky. It would have felt like they were just cruising as expected. And three, all of the men in the cockpit were completely fixated on this light bulb problem. In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit telling them they had dipped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet, they were now going down, nobody noticed. Although, to their credit, this alarm only sounded once and it wasn't that loud. And so not long after Don Repo had gone down into the hellhole, the plane crashed into the Everglades. No one on board Flight 401, from the cockpit crew to the passengers to the other flight staff, had any idea they were in an emergency until they hit the ground. And when they hit the ground, the plane exploded, and that was what Robert Marquis saw when he looked up and saw that yellow and orange flash. And so Robert and his friend, they speed over to the crash site, and when they get there, they are the first ones there. And even though they're looking out and they can hear the sound of all these people screaming and crying and moaning, they can't see anything because the fire from this huge explosion was already out because the swampy wetlands had pretty much immediately extinguished it. And even though the plane had crashed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it had not struck the ground at a very steep angle because basically the plane was in this gradual descent pattern and just kind of coasted until it hit the ground. And so that, combined with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, meant that the impact of the plane hitting the ground was not nearly as violent as other plane crashes were. And that ultimately saved lives. In fact, dozens of passengers survived the initial impact with the ground. But many of them were left with these horrible injuries, or they were trapped within the wreckage, or both. When Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash scene, Robert lifted up his headlamp and began to scan, and he saw all these body parts sticking out of the ground, and then his light rested on the first survivor he saw, and it was this man whose clothes had been completely burned off from the explosion. All he had on was just a little bit of his socks on both ankles. And this man was still strapped into the seat that he had been on the plane, and when the plane had broken up, his seat had fallen forward into the mud, pinning this man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of water. And so as Robert had scanned over with his light had hit this man's face, and he had looked up and pleaded with Robert and his friend to come get him before he drowned. And so Robert and his friend, they jumped off their boat and ran over to this guy and pulled the chair up and out of the water, saving this guy's life. But as soon as he was up and out of the water, Robert and his friend began hearing more calls from other people in the darkness screaming for help. Robert and his friend would do their absolute best to save as many people as they possibly could, but there was just too many people who needed saving and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the scene, the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters, and they, along with Robert and his friend, would spend the entire night pulling as many people to safety as they possibly could. By the time the sun came up on the following day, there were no other survivors left to save. All told, 99 people perished and 77 survived. Amongst the dead were Captain Bob Loft and his co-pilot Bert Stockstill and their flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole. Amongst these survivors was Angelo Donadeo, the fourth man in the cockpit, as well as Jerry Ascow, the man who ironically had written that letter to Eastern Airlines saying how wonderful that flight had been. A major investigation following the crash would confirm that the reason Flight 401 went down was because of a number of factors, most notably human error. The investigation would also confirm that the nose landing gear was working perfectly fine. The light bulb not coming on was a result of the light bulb being burned out. Following the investigation, Eastern Airlines would make every effort to compensate both the survivors of the crash and also families of those who were killed in the crash. Eastern Airlines would also make major changes to their training for their pilots and co-pilots and anybody that was ever going to be in the cockpit to ensure this type of disaster never happened again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401. For almost 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this intense pressure from Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks, there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you 2 of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these 2 women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these 2 women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011 just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the 2 women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those 2 elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other, and then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards. If you were to walk down the kitchen straight towards the front of the plane, you would eventually reach a wall that separated the kitchen to the lounge area, and there was a door slightly off to the right side on this wall that you could walk through to get into the lounge. So if you were standing in the kitchen and looking in the direction of this door, you wouldn't really be able to see into the lounge area because, again, the door was kind of off to the side. You would have to actually go over to the door and poke your head through to get a full unobstructed view of the lounge. And all the lounge was a couple of sofas and chairs kind of arranged in a circle. So Ginny has gotten back in the elevator and she's made her way back downstairs to continue looking for Denise. She gets down to the lower level, the doors open up, and she looks out into the kitchen and Denise is not there. In fact, the kitchen is totally empty. And the door leading into the lounge area is shut, so she can't even see in part of the way into the lounge to see if anybody is in there. But the second Ginny stepped off the elevator into the kitchen, she immediately had this powerful sense that Denise was definitely down there somewhere on the second level with her, probably in the lounge area that she couldn't see. And because Ginny felt so confident that Denise was down there, she actually didn't start by calling out for Denise or walking to the door, opening it up, and looking into the lounge to make sure Denise was there. Instead, Ginny just turned to the left and went to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. And as she's making these plates of food, Ginny would periodically look over at the closed door leading into the lounge, kind of expecting it to open up at any point and see Denise walk out. But after a couple of minutes, no one had opened the door from the lounge, and Ginny was thinking to herself, I'm making quite a bit of noise over here. If anybody was down here, wouldn't they come out of the lounge and just see who it was? And because Ginny, again, had this really intense feeling that she was not alone down there, she began to think, wait a minute, is Denise playing a practical joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge? Or is she hiding in one of the cabinets on the right side here, and she's going to jump out and grab me? And so the second Ginny began thinking about that, she became really paranoid. And so as she's making this food, she's pretty much constantly looking over at the door or kind of standing behind her, waiting for Denise to launch out and scare her. But again, after several more minutes, Ginny didn't see anybody come out of the lounge and none of the cabinet doors opened up. It was just her down there. However, the longer she stayed down there, the stronger that feeling got that someone was in the room with her. And so now she can't even make her food. She's completely turned around, just scanning all around the kitchen, really at this point, hoping Denise jumps out to scare her. And when Denise didn't do that, Ginny just began walking over to the door that would lead into the lounge. And so when she reached the door, her heart was racing like mad. She reached down to the handle, she turned it, she pushed it open, and she poked her head in real quick, and there was no one in the lounge. But immediately, the second her head was in that room, that feeling that someone was down there with her spiked, and she got chills all over her body. And she ran into the back of the lounge and looked behind all of the chairs and sofas, praying at this point that Denise was going to be down there. But after looking all over the back of the lounge, there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear. Because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear. Because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go all the way back across the lounge, through that door, into the kitchen to get back to the elevator so she can escape. And so Ginny almost instinctively moved immediately to the left side of the lounge and put her back up against the wall to make sure no one could be behind her. And then she began slowly inching her way along the left wall towards the door that was now open that would lead back into the kitchen. And as she's slowly shimmying along, her view of the kitchen is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the whole time she's thinking, I'm going to see someone in the kitchen because this sensation that someone is down here with me is not going away. But when she finally gets to the door and crosses into the kitchen, there's still no one there. And so she makes a run at that point to the elevator. She starts hitting the button. And as she's hitting the button, she's turning around and she has that awful feeling that someone's right behind her. And then finally the cart comes down. She hops inside the elevator. She shuts the doors. She hits the button and she begins going back up. When the elevator cart got back to the main level and the doors opened again, Ginny almost knocked over the flight attendant that was standing right outside of it, a woman named Mildred. And after Mildred and Ginny kind of regained their balance, they both looked at each other, and Mildred could see very clearly that Ginny looked horrible. She was totally pale, she was sweating. And so Mildred said, "Ginny, are you okay? What's going on?" And Ginny would just say, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred, instead of asking follow-up questions, just said, "Ginny, you need to come with me." And so Ginny would follow Mildred, who led them back around behind the elevators to the space in the back of the plane, kind of out of view of the passengers. And there, Ginny would find Denise. And Denise looked pale as a ghost, she was sweating, and looked totally shaken up. It would turn out, when Ginny left the lower level for the first time to come up to the main level to look for Denise, and then learned that Denise was not up there, that Denise had actually gone down to look for Ginny. In those few minutes that Ginny was up on the main level before she went back down again to continue looking for Denise, Denise was on the lower level. And Denise would say when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, there was no one down there, but immediately she believed Ginny had to be down there because of the strong sense that she was not alone down there. However, when she opened up the door to look into the lounge, she didn't see anyone and it totally spooked her. She shut the door, she ran back to the elevators, and she went back upstairs. And as she was going up in her elevator car, who, once again, passed her in the other elevator car? Ginny. And so once again, the two women did not see each other. And so these two women, who had never experienced anything like this before in their lives, had nearly identical experiences, totally independent of each other, just a couple of minutes apart in the exact same space. It was just too many coincidences for them to totally write it off. And so that was a big reason why they felt like they had to come forward with their information. 1 month later, plane number 318, the same plane that Ginny and Denise had had their frightening experiences on, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks from its crew before its flight to Miami that morning. After most of the checks were done, the passengers were allowed to board the plane, and then after it seemed like most of the passengers had arrived and taken their seats, the senior flight attendant, whose name was Sis, began counting the people on board the plane to make sure they had everyone. And after counting up and down the rows, she realized their head count was off by 1. They had one too many people. And so when Sis began recounting, she actually quickly identified the discrepancy. Sis was standing in first class in the aisle, and as she was counting down the left side of first class passengers, she noticed there was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in one of the seats. And so immediately Sis thought, oh, okay, I don't recognize this person, but since he's in uniform, he must be deadheading. Deadheading is a fairly common practice for airline employees where if they need to be on a particular flight but are not physically at the origin airport, they will just hop on another company flight that happens to be going to the airport they need to go to. And at least in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for employees not necessarily to tell the flight staff until they were literally on the plane, because these employees would just check the manifest, see if there were openings, and then climb on board. And so Sis assumed that was exactly what this man had done, and that was why he was unaccounted for, and it was why they had this extra person. And so she just needed to get his name to account for him. And so Sis turned and took a couple of steps until she was right in front of this guy who was still just seated looking straight ahead, and Sis introduced herself and asked him if he was deadheading. But the captain just continued to stare straight ahead and didn't even seem to register that Sis was talking to him, despite the fact that Sis was right on top of him and speaking very, very clearly and nobody else was talking. And so Sis, who was aware of the fact that this guy clearly should have heard her, just kind of waited for a second and then just asked again, hey, what's your name? I need to make sure that you are in fact deadheading. But again, this captain just sat there without moving and didn't remotely react to Sis. Now, by this point, another flight attendant named Diane had looked over and actually saw Sis having this strange interaction with this Eastern Airlines captain. And so Diane walked over and listened as Sis, for a third time, tried to get this guy's attention, but he still did nothing. And so Diane and Sis, they start looking at each other like, what do we do about this? And at some point, Sis just says, okay, I'm going to go tell the captain, he can deal with this. And so Diane stayed in the aisle next to this silent seated captain while Sis turned and walked towards the cockpit, and she told the captain, whose name was George. And so George, he leaves the cockpit with Sis by his side, and they start walking down the aisle back towards where this guy was and where Diane was. And by the time they get there, 6 other passengers kind of in the general vicinity had noticed something strange was going on. And so they were all kind of turned around in their seats, looking at this captain who was sitting there, and Diane and Sis and George kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And so George and Sis, they walk right up alongside Diane and this seated silent captain, and George immediately crouched down to get a good look at this guy's face. Because again, this captain is just looking straight ahead with a hat on, and so no one had really looked at him yet. And so George kneels down and he sees this guy's face for the first time, and he falls over and goes, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft!" The same Bob Loft who had died on Flight 401, the captain of Flight 401. George had known Bob really well and knew exactly what Bob looked like. But before Bob, Sis, Diane, or the 6 other passengers that were all watching could do anything, the seated silent captain that looked exactly like Bob Loft vanished into thin air right in front of all of them. And immediately, these 6 passengers on board the flight that saw this happen became hysterical. They could not understand what they had just seen. People are screaming and crying, and George, Diane, and Sis, they were very shaken at what they saw, but they knew they were in charge of this flight. And so they tried to calm down the passengers, but then very quickly, they organized a search of the plane because they're telling themselves, no one can just disappear into thin air. This guy has to be somewhere on the plane. And so for over an hour, the passengers were told to stay in their seats and were told to stay calm while the flight crew searched every crevice, every nook and cranny of this flight to see if they could find this guy. But they never did. And so after a very long delay, plane number 318, along with its very shaken up passengers and flight crew, eventually rumbled out onto the runway and took off. When they landed in Miami, the first thing George, Diane, and Sis all did is they went in and filed a report about what they had seen, about this vanishing person. But Eastern Airline didn't do anything about their reports. In fact, the logbook where these reports were kept was conspicuously missing a couple of weeks later when some other employees of the airline heard about this vanishing person and wanted to read the reports themselves. And when these employees went to their superiors and asked if they could get this logbook, the answer from the top was, George, Diane, and Sis never filed those reports. There was no vanishing person. This whole thing is a bunch of crap. But George, Diane, and Sis all said, we filed those reports. And apparently some other pilots within Eastern Airlines had actually seen the reports before the logbook went missing. And they would tell other people that what they read was terrifying. Over the next 2 years, there would be an astounding number of other totally unexplainable events that took place on other planes within Eastern Airlines' fleet. However, the strange events only occurred on L-1011 jets that had parts on them from the crashed Flight 401. Some of these unexplained events included more sightings of the silent seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. And in fact, one of those sightings was by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing this captain vanish into thin air right in front of him, the executive freaked out and ran off the plane and demanded the plane be searched top to bottom. But like the last search, nothing was found. On another occasion, the catering company that loaded food directly into the second level of these L-1011s, basically right into the kitchen, one of their staff spotted a man wandering around the lower level that looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from the doomed Flight 401. And when this staff member spoke to this man who looked like Don Repo turned towards him and then vanished into thin air. The catering company was so scared when this happened that they refused to go back into the plane, and it caused a massive delay. On another flight, on board plane number 318, the pilot and co-pilot began hearing banging coming from the hellhole, and when the pilot got up and opened up the hellhole and went down below and shined his light, he didn't see anything, but when he went to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing in the cockpit was once again Don Repo looking straight down at him, who then promptly vanished right in front of him. On another flight, a female passenger and coach, who had been quiet the entire flight, suddenly began screaming hysterically. And when they went up to her and asked her what was wrong, she was pointing at the seat next to her and said a man had suddenly appeared right next to her. He did not walk in, he just appeared next to her, and then when she began screaming, he vanished right in front of her. This woman was so upset that when they landed finally in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they pulled her off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful to the people on the plane. One captain said he walked into the cockpit, and standing in there was flight engineer Don Repo, and Don promptly told the captain about a specific malfunction in one of the engines before Don vanished in front of this captain. Now, this captain was horrified at what he had just seen, but he did actually go down and have that engine looked at, and sure enough, the malfunction that Don Repo said it had. Then finally, in 1974, all of these strange events just came to an abrupt stop. Now, no one knows exactly why, but in 1974, Eastern Airlines, despite telling the world they didn't believe any of the reports of these strange happenings on their planes, despite that year, they went into every single one of their L-1011 jets, and they removed any parts that had been placed on them from the crashed Flight 401. Despite the fact none of those parts were faulty. They were removing perfectly good parts, and they never gave a reason. And after they did that, all the sightings just stopped. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the Amazon Music follow button to a Ouija board session, and once everyone's fingers are on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the Amazon Music follow button, and then subtly move the pointer over no. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen. Of November 1st, 2002, a 54-year-old man named Lonnie Turner stood inside the back room of a funeral home, carefully trimming the hair on a dead man's head. Lonnie was the owner and head mortician of the Jones Funeral Home in Navasota, Texas, which is a small town just north of Houston. Lonnie had already drained the blood from the body and filled its veins with embalming fluid. Once he wrapped up the haircut, he dressed the body and then applied makeup, before moving it into its casket for the wake that afternoon. When he was done, Lonnie headed down the hallway and up the steps to his office. The whole time he walked, his feet ached. Lonnie was only 54, but lately, he'd been feeling exhausted from his job, and from all the volunteering he did outside of work. As he reached the sitting area outside his office, he looked at the photos that lined the walls. There were pictures of Lonnie with the town mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Navasota School Board. He was the first African-American member of the Navasota City Council, and just 2 years ago, he'd received the Citizen of the Year award from the Chamber of Commerce. The plaque hung on the wall just outside his office, and every time he looked at it, he felt a swell of pride. But when he went into his office, Lonnie's smile quickly faded. Because his 21-year-old son, Junior, was sitting in Lonnie's chair with his feet up on Lonnie's desk, talking loudly nonstop into his cell phone. Lonnie tried to get his son's attention, but Junior just clearly ignored him. So Lonnie just stood there, arms crossed, giving his son a very stern look. Finally, Junior stopped talking on the phone and turned to face his dad. But instead of saying hello to him, he told his dad that he was about to register for the Texas mortuary law exam, which he had to pass to get his mortician's license. And getting that license was the very first step for Junior to be able to take over the family business, something Lonnie was all too aware of. Now, Lonnie knew part of Junior probably just wanted to get out of his father's shadow. It had to be hard sometimes when your father was one of the most well-known people in town, but as much as Lonnie did want to hand over the funeral business to his son, he wasn't going to do that until he felt certain that his son could actually handle it. Because currently, his son acted really immature basically all the time. And so instead of Lonnie reacting to what his son had just told him about taking this mortuary exam, Lonnie just said, okay, well, there's still work to be done here at the funeral home. And then before Junior could protest, he told him he had to move their latest client's coffin into the chapel for the wake, he needed to order more embalming fluid, and get the company car washed. Then Lonnie threw the car keys to his son, and after Junior grabbed him, he just stood up and stormed out of the office looking totally annoyed. But Lonnie didn't care. He was tired of his son's bad attitude and entitled behavior, and he knew he needed to be tougher on Junior. If he didn't, he felt like Junior's habit of being sort of lazy could land him in serious trouble. Just then, Lonnie heard voices coming from outside of his office. He peeked into the hallway, and he saw his son talking to another young man. It was 19-year-old James White, Lonnie's godson. James had grown up around Lonnie's family, and had always looked at Lonnie like an uncle and at Junior like an older brother. Now, James worked part-time at the funeral home with both of them. But as Lonnie listened to this conversation that was going on, he realized his son was telling James to do several of the tasks that Lonnie had literally just assigned him. And he'd caught Junior doing this before, paying James extra to do work he wanted to avoid, and taking advantage of the fact that James looked up to him and would basically do whatever he asked. And this made Lonnie furious, because he didn't give Junior tasks just to keep him busy. They were a way of preparing him to take over this business. For Lonnie, this was just further proof that his son was not ready for serious responsibility. Lonnie sighed, but he didn't confront his son or James. He just let them do their work and then told them to leave early. Once they were gone, Lonnie spent the afternoon making preparations for upcoming funerals and speaking to grieving family members. By the time he could finally head home, he was totally exhausted. After locking up the funeral home, Lonnie drove through downtown Navasota towards a small neighborhood at the edge of town. When he pulled up in front of his big 2-story house, it was dark outside. He parked and walked around the house to the back porch. The light was on and the back door was unlocked, just like Lonnie always left it. He went inside and noticed that Junior wasn't home yet. Lonnie assumed he was out with his friends, like usual. So Lonnie just turned on the TV and made himself some dinner. He ate, watched some local news, and then spoke to a client on the phone around 9:15. They talked for a few minutes, and then after that, Lonnie headed to bed. And he was so tired from work that day that he fell asleep pretty much immediately. And he was sleeping soundly when suddenly there was this loud creaking noise that woke him up. Lonnie sat upright in bed, confused, and before his eyes could adjust to the darkness, he heard something else. The sound of breathing. Someone else was in the room with him. A couple hours later, just before midnight, Lonnie's son, Junior, pulled into the driveway outside the house. As always, he walked around to the back porch as well. But when he got there, he noticed the porch light wasn't on, and it typically was. And so he checked the bulb and actually found that it was slightly unscrewed. So he tightened it until the light came back on. After that, he opened the unlocked door and went inside. He headed upstairs to his bedroom, but on the way there, he noticed his father's bedroom door was open. Now, his dad always slept with the door shut, and it wasn't like him to be up this late. So Junior called out and asked if everything was okay, but there was no response. So Junior walked closer to the open door and peeked inside. But when he did, he saw his dad was not in bed. Instead, Lonnie was lying on the floor beside the bed, perfectly still. And on the wall above him was a huge, dark red streak of blood. Junior just stared for a moment in shock and then immediately turned and sprinted to his bedroom. There, he lifted up his mattress, revealing a collection of handguns, and he grabbed one at random. He jammed the gun into the waistband of his pants and then fled down the stairs. Junior burst through the back door, jumped into his car, and started speeding towards the nearest police station. As he drove, he used his cell phone to call 911. When the dispatcher asked what the emergency was, Junior told them his dad had been shot and killed. When they asked if he had checked for a pulse, he admitted that he hadn't. He said he'd left in a hurry because he was scared whoever had killed his dad might still be in the house. While Junior was speeding to the police station, an officer named Rob Bailey was patrolling the town. It had been a quiet night, that is until his radio crackled, and dispatch told him that a deadly shooting had just been reported at an address on the edge of town, and the shooter might still be inside the building. And Officer Bailey immediately recognized the address, because, like most officers on the Navasota police force, he knew Lonnie and the entire Turner family personally. And so he sped to Lonnie's house, praying that his friend was okay. When he got there, he parked and headed straight to the backyard, because he knew Lonnie always went in through his back door. But while he was rounding the house, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The lights were on downstairs, and he could see someone moving around inside. Now, part of Officer Bailey hoped that this shadowy figure was Lonnie himself, and that despite the report of a deadly shooting here, that Lonnie was somehow okay. But he knew that wasn't likely. More likely was this shadowy figure was the shooter. And so with his hand on his sidearm, Officer Bailey carefully walked to the back porch and knocked on the back door. There was a long moment of silence, then he heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and when Officer Bailey saw who was standing there, he was confused. He recognized the man. But it wasn't Lonnie Turner. It was Lonnie's brother, Lawson, which was very unusual because the officer knew that Lawson lived almost 3 hours away. And as for Lawson, he also looked confused to be seeing a police officer standing at the door. And when Officer Bailey told him that he was actually here responding to a possible shooting, Lawson looked even more bewildered. He said he didn't know anything about a shooting and said he had only arrived a few minutes ago and found the house totally empty. Officer Bailey didn't know what to make of that, but he asked Lawson to please wait outside, and then Officer Bailey went into the house. Bailey went straight to Lonnie's bedroom, and there, just as Junior had described it, he would find Lonnie Turner laying on the ground beside the bed with the wall streaked with blood behind him. Bailey leaned down to check his friend for a pulse, but there wasn't one. Officer Bailey just stood there for a moment, struggling to process the fact that his friend and one of the most respected men in the city was dead, most likely murdered. A moment later, Officer Bailey collected himself and radioed for backup. After that, he remembered that he had a possible suspect waiting outside. Officer Bailey rushed downstairs and out into the backyard. Lawson seemed eager for news about whatever was going on, but Officer Bailey wasn't sure how much he should say. He was a patrol officer, not a homicide investigator, so he was kind of out of his depth. But he still felt like he had to do something. So he asked Lawson what he was doing at his brother's house. Lawson said he was on his way to Houston and he was planning to spend the night at his brother's house to break up the drive. He said he'd gotten to the house just a few minutes before Officer Bailey did, and when he'd gone inside, he'd called out for Lonnie, but no one had answered. He'd even looked in Lonnie's bedroom and didn't see him, so he figured Lonnie was out dealing with some funeral home business and would be back soon. And listening to this, Officer Bailey literally couldn't believe what Lawson was saying. The walls in Lonnie's bedroom were literally covered in blood, and his brother's body was literally laying on the floor in front of him. It didn't make sense that Lawson could have looked inside that room and not noticed those things. So even though Officer Bailey was not a detective and was not in charge of this case, he wanted to see how Lawson would react to the news of his brother's death. So he just came right out and told him. And when he did, Lawson looked shocked and then totally devastated, and then he broke down sobbing. Officer Bailey watched him, trying to judge if his tears were genuine, but he couldn't tell. But just then, Officer Bailey looked up and saw headlights approaching the house. Detective Travis Higginbotham parked in Lonnie's driveway. Higginbotham worked for the district attorney's office and had been appointed as the lead investigator on this case. He already knew that the murder of a local celebrity would garner plenty of attention, and also the fact that the Texas Rangers, who were the state police, had been called in to help on this case only made it more high profile. And so for Detective Higginbotham, he knew this case could either make his career or break it. Higginbotham got out of his car and met up with Officer Bailey in the backyard, and he was surprised to see another man was sitting outside and crying. Officer Bailey quickly explained the situation, and the detective agreed that Lawson seemed suspicious. But before Higginbotham could even begin to think about that, he needed to go inside and survey the crime scene. He went to Lonnie's bedroom and took note of the trajectory of the blood spatter on the walls. Then he examined Lonnie's body, and the detective found 2 bullet casings from a 9mm pistol nearby. Given the location of the wounds and the fact that there was no gun anywhere in the room, it was fairly obvious this couldn't be a suicide. So Detective Higginbotham started looking around for clues about a possible motive for murder. Nothing in Lonnie's bedroom, or the rest of the house for that matter, had been disturbed. Lonnie's wallet and his watch were out in plain sight, and there was also $7,000 in cash in an unlocked safe. So it didn't seem like the motive for this was robbery. There were also no signs of a break-in, which made sense considering Lonnie kept his back door unlocked. But that also meant whoever killed Lonnie likely knew in advance he did not lock his back door. So it seemed like a working theory was whoever killed Lonnie knew him personally and maybe had some kind of vendetta against him. As he was thinking this over, Detective Higginbotham heard Lonnie's brother, Lawson, still sobbing outside in the yard. And so Higginbotham got up and headed out to question him. Lawson was clearly distraught, and he started by just repeating everything he'd already told Officer Bailey. And like Officer Bailey, Detective Higginbotham found his story to be very suspicious. The idea he looked in his brother's room and didn't notice his brother's body or the blood on the wall just didn't make any sense. So Higginbotham leaned forward and asked Lawson a much more pointed question. Did he own a gun? Without hesitating, Lawson fired a gun that evening because Lawson could have fired a gun with gloves on, or he could have just vigorously washed his hands afterwards. And so because Detective Higginbotham didn't have any other evidence against Lawson, he had to let him go for now. But the detective was not totally disappointed, because he had another person of interest waiting for him right down the hall. In a nearby interview room, a Texas Ranger was already questioning Lonnie's son, Junior. Detective Higginbotham joined their session and began observing Junior's behavior. Unlike Lawson, who'd been devastated by his brother's death, Junior seemed strangely calm. And his story also seemed very suspicious. According to Junior, when he'd seen the blood on his dad's wall, he had immediately assumed that his dad was shot and killed, even though he didn't hear gunshots or see shell casings, and he didn't check to see if his dad still had a pulse. Junior claimed this was all just gut instinct, but Detective Higginbotham thought it sounded more like Junior already knew what had happened before he'd ever stepped foot into his father's room. But again, Junior swore that was not true. He said he'd been terrified that whoever had shot his dad was still in the house, so he grabbed one of his own guns to protect himself, And then to prove his story, Junior pulled a handgun from his belt and placed it on the table. Higginbotham was stunned. Civilians were not supposed to be allowed to bring weapons into police stations. The detective didn't even know how Junior managed to get the gun inside. But regardless, Junior having a gun during his interview definitely did not make him look any less guilty. However, when Detective Higginbotham took a closer look at the weapon, he saw it was not a 9mm. But still, if Junior owned an arsenal of handguns, the detective figured there could be a 9mm in there somewhere. So, just to be safe, Detective Higginbotham also had Junior's hands swabbed for gunshot residue. And this time, the test came back positive, which would typically mean that Junior fired a weapon that night. But once again, the results were inconclusive, because in theory, Junior could have gotten that residue on his hands simply by handling the pistol he brought into the station. Higginbotham was weighing this possibility when he got a call from the team of investigators who were still collecting evidence at the crime scene. They'd just found the cache of guns under Junior's mattress, and one of them was a 9mm pistol. Now, it would have to be tested against the shell casings found at the crime scene, which would take time, but it could be the murder weapon. And when Higginbotham confronted Junior about this, Junior's response shocked the detective, because Junior claimed that that specific 9mm gun had actually disappeared from his collection several weeks ago. He had no idea how it had gotten back under his mattress. To the detective, this excuse sounded ridiculous, but he asked Junior if, when the gun went missing, did you report it missing? And Junior said no. At this point, Junior's story seemed to be getting flimsier and flimsier. But one thing prevented Detective Higginbotham from arresting him on the spot. Junior claimed to have an alibi. He said he had spent most of the night hanging out with his girlfriend. They ate at a restaurant, then headed to her place for a few hours, and then on his way home after the date, he stopped at a car wash. Higginbotham wrote down Junior's girlfriend's name, as well as the name of the car wash, so he could look into the alibi later. In the meantime, he let Junior go, but promised they would speak again soon. The next morning, Detective Higginbotham made several calls to verify Junior's alibi, and pretty much everything Junior had said checked out. He'd definitely been to his girlfriend's house and the car wash, but there were still small gaps in his schedule where he theoretically could have had time to go home and kill his dad. The detective sighed. Junior and Lawson both had such unbelievable stories. He was sure one of them was lying, but he just couldn't tell which one. Just then, the phone on Detective Higginbotham's desk rang. It was the district attorney, and he had big news. A police officer who'd been cataloging evidence at Lonnie's house had gone on a smoke break, and when he did, he found a pair of gloves and a makeshift mask lying in a creek just 25 yards from Lonnie's front door. Detective Higginbotham's eyes went wide. He knew that if Lonnie's killer had worn that mask, it would probably still carry trace amounts of their saliva, which would contain their DNA. Testing the mask for DNA would take time, but it could potentially solve the case. Higginbotham ended the call feeling much more optimistic about the case. He arranged for DNA samples to be collected from Junior and Lawson so he could compare them to the mask. But almost as soon as the detective did that, he received another phone call. And this one sent him in a totally different direction. That call was from a Texas Ranger who said he'd done some digging, and he had discovered a criminal case involving Lonnie from a few months before his death. Apparently, a thief had stolen several blank checks from Lonnie's office, then made them out to himself, forged Lonnie's signature, and stole close to $8,000 from Lonnie's account. Lonnie found out and pressed charges. And because he pressed charges, this meant the police had copies of those fraudulent checks, and those checks had the thief's name written on them. The thief was Lonnie's 19-year-old godson, James White. After speaking to the Texas Ranger, Higginbotham asked around and learned that James White worked part-time at the funeral home. Evidently, Lonnie had forgiven him for the theft, but Detective Higginbotham didn't think that made James trustworthy. In fact, he thought that James could be just as strong of a suspect as Junior and Lawson. James was close to the family, he likely knew that Lonnie kept his back door unlocked, He also might have even known where Junior hid his guns. And so Detective Higginbotham knew he needed to question James immediately. So he made some calls, and before long, he managed to track James down. James seemed very upset about the death of his godfather, but he was very cooperative and answered all of the detective's questions. And he admitted to forging the checks, but vehemently denied any involvement in Lonnie's death. And like Junior, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. James said he'd been at a club in a neighboring town with some friends who would all be able to confirm the story. Detective Higginbotham promised to contact them. Then he thought back to the mask that had been found outside of Lonnie's home, and he asked if James would be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample. And right away, James said yes. Higginbotham collected a DNA sample from James and then headed back to the DA's office. When he got there, he sent James's DNA to be tested alongside the mask, just like Junior's and Lawson's. After that, he went into his office and he found a report on his desk. It was from the ballistics lab. They'd analyzed the shell casings from the crime scene and the 9mm pistol found under Junior's mattress, and they had confirmed what Detective Higginbotham already suspected. Junior's 9mm gun was in fact the murder weapon. Reading this, Detective Higginbotham was ready to arrest Junior right then, but when he asked the district attorney for approval, he said no. The DA said it was too early to make an arrest. With all the attention Lonnie's murder was getting, their case needed to be airtight. So before they made their move, they had to wait for the results of the DNA test on that mask. Detective Higginbotham knew there was always a chance the DNA test results could be inconclusive and get them nothing. So he continued to investigate his main suspects, and he kept an especially close eye on Junior. And in the weeks following his father's death, Junior went on a massive shopping spree with his inheritance. He bought an expensive boat and a luxury car, and he also hired a lawyer, even though he had not been charged with anything. This only made the detective more certain that Junior had to be guilty, and he was about to march into the DA's office and ask for permission to arrest Junior again, but he knew what they'd say. He would need more evidence. But then, 2 months after Lonnie's death, Higginbotham heard from a fellow detective that a different suspect was also behaving erratically. Lonnie's godson, James, had been caught trying to rob a bar, and during the robbery, he hit the owner of the bar with a cash register. Clearly, James was hard up for cash and willing to go to extreme and violent lengths to get it. With this, Detective Higginbotham found himself feeling totally overwhelmed by all the evidence against each of his potential suspects. However, all this evidence was kind of all over the place. He couldn't really put it all together. And so he went into his office, sat down at his desk, and went back over all the information he had about James, Lawson, and Junior. James was a known thief with access to Lonnie's house. He could have easily gotten inside and killed Lonnie during a robbery gone wrong. However, no valuables had been taken from the crime scene, which didn't seem to add up if the motive was burglary. Then there was Lawson. He was literally in the house when police arrived, and his story about looking in his brother's bedroom and not noticing the blood on the wall or the body on the ground was hard to believe. And finally, there was Junior. Junior owned the murder weapon and had gunshot residue on his hands on the night of the murder, and also the fact that he fled the crime scene before verifying that his father was actually dead still just didn't sit right with Detective Higginbotham. And most importantly, Junior stood to benefit the most from his father's death. With Lonnie out of the way, he inherited a significant amount of money and a successful funeral home business. And so Detective Higginbotham was sure he was so close to figuring out who killed Lonnie. And sure enough, just a few days later, the DNA test results from the mask came back. And when Higginbotham saw them, he knew the case was solved. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Lonnie Turner on the evening of November 1st, 2002. That night, sometime between 9:15 and 10 p.m., the killer drove into Lonnie's neighborhood with their headlights off. They parked outside of Lonnie's house, then put on their gloves and their mask, a mask they had made earlier by cutting holes in a gym shoe bag. Now, if all went according to their plan, no one would see them tonight. But if somebody did catch a glimpse of them, the killer could not afford to be recognized. And so as an extra safety measure, the killer grabbed a 9mm pistol that they'd brought with them, and then stepped out of the car and hurried towards the back of Lonnie's house. When they got to the porch, they reached up and unscrewed the porch light bulb just enough to break the circuit and kill the light. Then the killer reached for the doorknob, and as expected, it was unlocked. The killer headed inside and went straight for the master bedroom. They knew the thing they'd come here for was inside of that room. They reached the door, turned the knob, and carefully pushed the door open just a crack. The killer peeked inside. He saw Lonnie was lying in bed, snoring. The killer watched Lonnie for several seconds. They knew entering the room was risky, but at this point, they'd come too far to turn back now. So eventually, they pushed the door open further and began to go inside. However, the killer only got 1 foot into the bedroom before the door made a loud creaking sound. The killer froze. They looked over at the bed, and to their horror, Lonnie stopped snoring, sat up suddenly, and looked right over at them. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. The killer had no idea if Lonnie could recognize them with their mask on, but Lonnie looked like he was about to stand up and confront them, so in a panic, the killer raised their gun and fired. Lonnie screamed, and the killer immediately fired again, and Lonnie went limp and then rolled off the bed onto the ground. The killer was so shocked by what they'd done that they didn't even wait to see if Lonnie was dead. Instead, they just turned and ran out of the room, completely forgetting the thing they had come here for. And the killer was almost out the door and out of Lonnie's house when they realized they couldn't just flee the scene while carrying the murder weapon. So they ran back inside, went to another bedroom, lifted up the mattress, and dropped the gun underneath. After that, the killer sprinted out the back door, tore off their gloves and mask, tossed them in a nearby ditch, and then jumped into their car and sped away. In their panic, the killer never considered the fact that they had been breathing through that mask the entire time they were in the house. So they didn't realize that that mask was full of their DNA. And so if investigators got the mask, it would lead them directly to the killer. When Detective Higginbotham saw the DNA test results, he knew the killer was not Lonnie's son, Jr., who owned the murder weapon, and it wasn't Lonnie's brother, Lawson, who was in the house when police showed up. Instead, the killer was James White, Lonnie Turner's 19-year-old godson. James was desperate for money and willing to do just about anything to get it. And he'd been to Lonnie's house countless times, so he knew Lonnie kept the back door unlocked, and he kept a safe full of cash in the master bedroom. He also knew where Junior kept his gun collection. Finally, on the evening of November 1st, James put his plan into action. But when the bedroom door creaked and it woke Lonnie up, James knew he was caught. So he shot Lonnie in a panic and then ran away without even taking any money, even though Lonnie's safe, which contained $7,000 in cash, was sitting unlocked not far away. Which means James killed his godfather for nothing. James was arrested and quickly confessed to pulling the trigger. He also admitted that he'd convinced his friends to lie about his alibi. However, James insisted that the crime was not actually his idea. He claimed Lonnie's son, Jr., had literally forced him to commit the murder at gunpoint because Jr. wanted his inheritance. However, there was no evidence suggesting that actually happened. Ultimately, James White would make a plea deal and received a 20-year sentence. 24-year-old Gina Allen and her brand new boyfriend, 28-year-old Brandon Day, could not believe their luck. For the past 48 hours, they had been stranded in the rugged wilderness of the San Jacinto mountain range in California when they looked down into this ravine and they saw a campsite. There was a tarp that had been strung up between two trees. And so they ran over to it hoping that the owner of this campsite would be in there and they could help them get out of these mountains. But when they got to the campsite, there wasn't anyone there. But from the looks of it, it looked like someone had been living in this site fairly recently. Underneath this makeshift roof from this tarp was a sleeping pad, there was a warm sweater, there was shoes, there was a disposable razor, some kitchen utensils, and there was a yellow backpack. Without any hesitation, Brandon and Gina, who were totally famished and they're exhausted and they're desperate, they just start rifling through the different things in camp, hoping to find some things that will help save their life, like a cell phone or a radio, or even just a lighter or some matches or some food. And so Brandon focused on all the items that are just kind of laying out under the tarp, and Gina focused on the contents of the yellow backpack. And so Gina, she opens up this backpack and she starts pulling out all these maps that are inside. And she notices on the margins of these maps in the white space, there is handwriting, and it's done in pen, and it looks like it's been written fairly recently. Now, at first, she didn't read any of the notes that were on these margins. She was just kind of pulling them out and stacking them on the ground next to her and continuing to rummage through this bag. But at some point, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed on the top map that was sitting on the ground next to her, there was a particular note at the top of the page that as soon as she saw it, she stopped what she was doing, she turned and looked at it. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in fact, she didn't want to get her hopes up, but she slowly reached over, she picked the map up, and she put it right in front of her face, and as soon as she was reading it, she just started laughing. She was so happy, she was so relieved, she yelled to Brandon to come over and look at this. And so Brandon stopped what he was doing, he turned around, and he bent down, and he looked exactly where she was looking, and when he read what she had read, he started laughing too. They were saved. There, at the top of this map, there was a note that was dated the same date as the day they were there, May 8th. And so they knew whoever had written this had written it at least in the last couple of hours because it was May 8th. And so they had to be around here somewhere. And so Gina and Brandon, they stand up and they start yelling out for the owner of this camp to please come out and help them. But in their excitement, Brandon and Gina had overlooked a critical detail in this note. And it would turn out that critical detail would change their lives and the life of the man who owned this camp forever. Before Brandon and Gina ever began their doomed hike into the San Jacinto mountain range, another man, one which neither of them knew, was gearing up for a hike of his own that would take him through the San Jacinto mountain range. His name was John Donovan, and on April 19th, 2005, which was the day he would begin this journey, he was 59 years old. John had absolutely no family. He was born an only child, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had been orphaned and basically had to raise himself from that point onward. By the time John was in his 20s, he had moved to Virginia, where he had taken a job as a social worker. And despite making a fairly decent salary, he refused to spend any more money than he absolutely had to. It was a habit he had developed as an orphan child trying to make ends meet with virtually no money whatsoever, and as an adult, that habit just never left him. So as a result, for his entire life, all the way up until he left for that hike in 2005, he never had anything nice. He basically wore the exact same outfit virtually every single day. He never owned a car, he never owned a phone, he never owned a computer, and when it came to where he chose to live, he would always live in the most absurdly cheap dwellings possible, which included at one point living in a partially burned down, abandoned savings bank with no heat. John was a proud Irish Catholic, he drank lots of whiskey, he swore like a sailor, and he had no problem speaking his mind no matter who he was talking to. While he was a lovely person once you got to meet him, his unorthodox lifestyle and his at times gruff exterior made it pretty difficult for him to make friends for most of his life. But when he was in his 40s, he wanted to lose some weight, and so he decided to join a hiking club. And to his surprise, the other members of this hiking club adored him. They thought he was hysterical, and he made being out on the trails so much more fun and enjoyable. And before long, all these members of this club became John's family that he never had. And so John would go on every single trip this hiking club went on, no matter what. That was the most important thing to him in his life. When it came to hiking, though, John was a bit of an anomaly. Even though he would hike sometimes over 4,000 miles in any given year, he would still routinely get lost on trails he had been on dozens and dozens of times. But despite being totally self-aware of this fatal flaw in his hiking abilities, John rarely did anything to compensate for it. For example, he didn't bring with him on most hikes a compass, which would be the first thing you would think to bring with you to stay oriented. Also, because he refused to buy a phone, he didn't have that to aid him either if he ever got lost. In fact, John rarely brought much of anything on any hike he went on, because John is what you would call a ultralight backpacker, which basically meant you would only pack the absolute bare essentials, and in John's case, sometimes less than the absolute bare essentials. And despite his friends trying repeatedly to get him to pack more equipment so he was more prepared, he would always say, no, he knows what he's doing and everything is good. And the truth is, John always did manage to get from point A to point B on all of his hikes, some of which included extremely difficult hikes, like the time he hiked the 500-mile-long Colorado Trail, or the time he hiked the 2,175-mile-long Appalachian Trail. Now, John would tell you that was all skill, but his friends would say John was extremely lucky. He would get lost, and then at the last second he would find the trail again, or he would lose some piece of critical equipment, and then just someone on the trail would happen to walk by that had an extra set of whatever it was that John needed. And then one time when John was in Poland on a hike, he slipped on this icy embankment where earlier that day, 2 other hikers had slipped and fallen to their deaths. And John has now slipped on this same embankment. He's careening down the sides. He's flailing. He can't stop himself. Hikers had slipped and fallen to their deaths. And John has now slipped on this same embankment. He's careening down the sides. He's flailing. He can't stop himself. And then the drawstring on his pants gets caught up in a tree, and that arrests his fall and it saves his life. And so from that point on, John would only wear those pants when he went hiking, and he called them his lucky pants. In the spring of 2005, John and one of his very close hiking friends named Ken Baker, who was roughly his age, decided they were going to hike the 2,650-mile-long Pacific Crest Trail. This trail spanned the entire west coast of the United States. It starts in Southern California, right on the border of Mexico, and it goes all the way up to the very northern end of Washington State, right on the border of Canada. It takes the average hiker, if they're going to do this entire trail in one go, about 5 months, unless there's bad weather conditions that impede them along the way. John had been excitedly planning this epically long hike for the better part of the last year. He had actually typed out 6 pages on his typewriter of this itinerary that planned out every single detail of this hike, down to how many ounces of coffee he would need at every stop along the way. John was especially excited about this particular hike because it was going to be the very first hike he would be doing after his retirement from being a social worker. And apparently John had huge plans for his retirement. He wanted to travel all over the United States. He wanted to go to Australia, to China, to Russia. He basically wanted to hike at least 6 months a year, every single year, until he was too old or too weak to continue to do so. But just a couple of days before John and Ken were supposed to fly out to California to begin the Pacific Crest Trail, Ken told John that he thought they should actually postpone the start of this trip by about 3 weeks. He said Southern California had experienced their snowiest winter in decades, and so it would make sense to wait a little bit of extra time to make sure all the snow had melted and that they didn't get caught in any sort of late snowstorm. Now, John was totally not having this. He had spent so much time thinking about this trip. He was so excited about it that he just couldn't wait any longer. And so he told Ken, I'm sorry, I'm going on the current timeline, whether I go alone or not. And so on April 19th, 2005, John made his way to his office where he was a social worker. His coworkers threw him a very small retirement party, and he literally left the office, went straight to the airport, and he flew to Southern California all alone. When he got there, he took a chance and reached out to one of his other hiking friends, a 48-year-old tool salesman named Lynn Paget, and asked him, hey, I know you live in the area. Would you be interested in coming on at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail with me? I'm going to start here in the next couple of days. And John was extremely excited when Lynn said, you know what? Sure, I'd love to come along with you. And the two of them made their way over to Campo, California, which is right on the border of Mexico, and they began their hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. But after going only about 100 miles, Lynn's feet started swelling so badly that he could not go any farther. And so from that point onward, John would be alone. The San Jacinto mountain range is the first major mountain range that the northbound Pacific Crest Trail hikers will encounter, and statistically, it's actually the most dangerous portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, as 15% of all the fatalities that occur along this huge trail occur in the San Jacinto mountain range. It's a very steep mountain with a rapid rise in elevation from the desert floor all the way up to over 10,000 feet, which means in the summer, even when it's extremely hot down around the base of this mountain, it will probably be windy and snowing at the top. John reached the base of the San Jacinto mountain range on May 2nd, and as he began his slow climb up, all of the hikers he was encountering were all talking about the same thing. There was apparently some big snowstorm that was due to hit the San Jacinto mountain range in the next couple of days, and so all of these hikers were actually evacuating the mountain to go to this little town to wait out the storm. Everyone's fear was they would get caught on Fuller Ridge when the storm hit. Fuller Ridge is towards the top of the San Jacinto mountain range, and it's probably the most dangerous part of the entire mountain range. It's basically this totally exposed, very steep section where if you lose your footing, there's nothing to stop you from tumbling down to your death. But when John heard this, he wasn't fazed at all. He was not about to evacuate because of some storm. He was just going to continue up this mountain, go over Fuller's Ridge, and carry on along the Pacific Crest Trail. And so for the rest of the day, he just continued up the mountain and eventually made camp about halfway up. He actually stopped near two other hikers that were also going to push through despite this storm. It was a 46-year-old nurse from Canada named Connie Davis and her son, 20-year-old Alex. And they were both very experienced high-altitude climbers, and they had all the right gear, and they were very well prepared. And so that night, after both parties had set up their camp, they struck up a friendly conversation, during which John made some dismissive comments about Connie's parenting style that really agitated her, although it didn't seem like John really noticed he had upset her. And so needless to say, the next morning, Connie and her son had packed up and were long gone by the time John was waking up. So John just got up, he looked at the sky, it was still clear, although he did see some gray clouds rolling in, so he could sense that yes, a storm really is on the way, but he decided he was still just going to continue on towards Fuller Ridge. So he put his backpack on and he began walking up the trail, and a little while later, when he was nearing Fuller Ridge but was still several miles away, three very well-equipped hikers that he had not seen before came charging down the path towards him. And John stopped them and he said, "Hey, how is it up there? What's the weather like? What's Fuller Ridge like?" And they kind of looked at John and sized him up, looking up and down, and they saw that, he's got light clothes on, he's got sneakers on, he doesn't have trekking poles, he just looks totally ill-prepared for what he's walking into. And they said to him, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue on here. This storm is going to hit any time now, and we're not going to Fuller Ridge. We're actually turning around and leaving because of this storm, and we have all the right gear. You should really consider turning around and leaving." But these three hikers would say there was just no way they were going to change John's mind. He was totally dead set on carrying on to Fuller Ridge. And so the three men that had told him not to go eventually just said, "Okay, good luck." And they carried on down the trail, and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually eventually just said, "Okay, good luck." And they carried on down the trail, and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually started to fall sometime in the mid-afternoon, John started to have doubts about his plans. There was already a lot of snow on the ground where he was from previous snowstorms, and that was making it hard to see the trail as it was. And now with all this additional snow starting to dump down, he was worried it was going to totally cover up the trail and he would lose it. And since he knew he kind of had a penchant for getting lost on trails, this was a real concern. But he was still very stubborn, and so despite these second thoughts, he just continued on along. And so after a while, he got to within maybe 1 or 2 miles of Fuller Ridge when he spotted up ahead of him 2 other hikers that seemed to be going in that direction. And so he ran up to them and he yelled for them to stop. And at this point, the snow is really starting to come down and the trail is completely wiped out and he can barely see in front of him. And these 2 hikers, they stop. And so he runs up to them, and when he gets up close, he can see it's actually Connie Davis and her son Alex from the night before. And so Connie is obviously not thrilled to see John again, but when he explained that he was having a really hard time staying on the trail and, could he just tag along with them, Connie said, "You know what, that's just fine, we're happy to have you." But she explained to him she was not going up to Fuller Ridge. Instead, she was taking a more circuitous route that would bypass the ridge. It would take a lot longer, but it would be safer given the weather conditions. John assured her that that was totally fine. He would just trail along with them, and then at some point he would break off on his own and he would go up to Fuller Ridge and they could go their separate way. And so Connie, her son, and John begin walking along together. Now, Connie and Alex, they had crampons on their shoes, which are basically like metal cleats and allow you to very easily grip the snow and ice. They had trekking poles, they had all the right warm gear, and so they're easily moving along through these weather conditions. Meanwhile, John didn't have trekking poles or any high-speed equipment. He did have crampons that he tried to put onto his shoes, but because he had sneakers that were not lined up to this type of crampon, they didn't really fit right, and so it caused him to constantly stumble and fall on the ground. And so that's how it went for a while until Connie and Alex reached this critical point. It was at this creek where they needed to go down and around, which would take them away from Fuller Ridge. And if John was going to continue, like he said he would, up to Fuller Ridge, that would be the point where he would break off from them and go up the mountain towards this ridge. And so Connie and Alex wait at the stream. They're turned around and they're looking back down the trail at John, who's fallen way behind at this point. And as they're looking at him, they're thinking, this is going to take a long time for him to finally catch up to us. And so Connie, who really wasn't all that keen in hanging around John that much longer anyways, she figured, you know what, John has made his intentions completely clear. He said he is going up to Fuller Ridge. He is an adult. He is healthy. He can do whatever he wants. And so she yelled and waved to John and signaled that she and her son were going to go down this creek and this way to Fuller Ridge. So best of luck to you. And then Connie and Alex disappeared around the corner. Once John's hiking partners had gone, John got up to that creek and he was going to try to go up to Fuller Ridge. But by that point, the snow was practically blinding. And so at this point, John decided, you know what? I do need to turn around and go back down the mountain and evacuate to that town where everybody else had gone to avoid the storm. And so John turns around and starts trying to backtrack along this trail back down the mountain, but the trail is gone. The snow has completely whited it out, and there's no other hikers anywhere nearby, and even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see them. And so for several hours, while it was still light out, John did his best to navigate down the mountain, and then when the sun went down, he really had no idea where he was. And so instead of trying to stay on this trail that at this point he really didn't think he was on, he looked out away from the mountain, and way down below, he saw this big bright cluster of lights. Even through the falling snow, he could clearly see those were lights of a city. And so he decided he would use that as kind of like his North Star, and he would just continuously walk downhill towards those lights. And so for several hours, he just began walking towards these lights, narrowly avoiding huge drop-offs and climbing over boulders and avoiding trees and animals. And finally, he got to this very critical point in his journey down to these lights. He reached this area called Long Valley, where he had a decision to make. He could either continue down the mountain, which would require jumping down into this ravine that once he did, he would not be able to climb back out again. It was too steep. Or he could turn around and hike way back up the mountain and go some other direction. But at this point, he had really no idea what direction was the best direction. All he knew is he needed to go down the mountain because his situation was getting worse and worse by the second. If he didn't find shelter soon, he might get hypothermia and just die out here. And so he decided he would jump down into this ravine. And so he laid on his stomach, he lowered himself down over the edge, and he dropped down into the valley below. Once he stood up, he just continued walking down the mountain, and at some point he spotted a stream that he began to follow along. And as he followed this ravine, which was taking him straight down the mountain, he noticed the ravine walls, these huge walls on either side of him, seemed to get closer and closer to him, like this ravine was kind of coming to a point. And then after a while, he noticed up ahead, the stream just kind of disappeared. And so he walked a little bit farther, and then he came to an abrupt stop. The water had disappeared because it had flown off a 100-foot cliff that he was now standing in front of. He had come to the edge of this huge waterfall, and there was absolutely no way to lower himself down over it. It was an absolute fall to the death if he attempted to go down this waterfall. And so he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and these huge canyon walls that had followed him all the way to this edge from when he dropped down, they were sheer cliffs. There was no way to climb those. And his initial drop into this ravine was unclimbable. He knew that going in. And so he was boxed in, he was trapped, and he likely knew that it would be at least a week or more before anybody figured out that he was even missing. And so totally disheartened, John left the edge of this cliff, this waterfall, and walked back up to a relatively flat area farther up the ravine, and he began to set up camp. He pulled out his green tarp, he put some line between two trees, he made a makeshift roof, he laid out his bed mat underneath, and then he climbed underneath the tarp and he settled in for a long night. The next morning, when the sun came up, John attempted to make a fire, but none of the wood he was finding was dry enough, so all of his fires just kind of smoldered but didn't really catch. He had a mirror, a signal mirror, and he was prepared to flag down any aircraft that flew overhead, but no aircraft did, so he didn't flag anyone down. And so by the end of that night, he was back under his tarp, having made no progress, settling in for another freezing cold, sleepless night. The next morning, when the sun finally came up again, John was totally disheartened, and he decided to start jotting notes down on the margins of his map, which was the only place he had space to write. He figured he would keep a sort of diary, that way if he didn't get out of here, someone would figure out what happened to him. And so his first entry was that day, May 5th, and he wrote that his friend Ken was right. He should have postponed this trip by 3 weeks and avoided the bad weather. Ken was the smart one. And also in this May 5th entry, he took an inventory of his food supply. He said he only had 12 cheese crackers left. And then on May 8th, John wrote a note that said, took a fall, too weak to climb out of canyon, down is a gorge, no way out. This was the message that Gina and Brandon discovered when they stumbled on this campsite. But the significance of this note was not literally what he wrote, but rather when he wrote it. On May 6th, Brandon Day and his girlfriend, Gina Allen, were in Palm Springs for a business convention. Brandon was a financial advisor, and so he was out here for business, and Gina was his guest, so she was really just vacationing. And so towards the end of the convention, when Brandon had some free time, he and Gina decided to leave the hotel and go on a hike somewhere. And so they actually linked up with a tour group that was leaving the hotel, that was heading over to this tram station, where they were going to take a tram car all the way up to the top of the San Jacinto mountain range. A tram car is basically like a ski lift, except once you ride it to the top of the mountain, you don't do any skiing, you just do sightseeing. And so Brandon and Gina, they get to this tram car, they hop inside, they get to the top, and it's totally amazing, beautiful view, there's snow at the top, and they're told they have about 20 or 30 minutes before their group is going to take the tram car back down again. And so Brandon and Gina decide to kind of venture off away from the main group and have some alone time before they leave again. And as they kind of venture off, they start to hear what sounds like a waterfall. And so the two of them are kind of looking around, asking if they can see it or if they know where it is, and they don't. And so they say, hey, do you want to just leave the trail and walk towards this waterfall? It can't be far. It sounds like it's only maybe a couple of minutes away. We'll take some pictures, we'll come back, and then we'll catch the tram back down again. And so they decide this is a great idea. They leave the path and they start walking towards the sound of this waterfall. But after walking for a pretty significant distance, they realize the sound of this waterfall is not getting any closer. It seems to actually just be getting farther and farther away. And what they didn't know was happening was the sound of the waterfall was actually echoing off the walls of this mountain. It was basically playing a trick on them. The acoustics made it seem like it was really close, but really it wasn't. It was pretty far away. And so by the time they finally did locate this waterfall, they knew they had ventured fairly far off the main trail, and they really needed to hustle to get back up to the tram station to meet their group and catch that last car out. And so they took a couple of pictures of this waterfall and then quickly turned around and began booking it back towards the station. But on their return trip, which they believed they were going in the right direction, they started hearing the sound of voices coming from the tram station, but they were coming from a different direction. And so Gina and Brandon stopped and they're thinking, I think we got to go this way, but clearly that's the sound of the other people in our group coming from that direction. And so they decide to follow the sound of the voices. But just like the sound of the waterfall, the sound of the voices were not coming from that direction. That was just an echo bouncing off the walls. It was basically a trick the mountain was playing on Brandon and Gina. And so they start walking in the wrong direction, and after walking for quite a while and not getting anywhere nearer the tram station, the voices just finally stop. And they look at their watches and they realize they missed the cutoff. They missed the last tram. All those tourists they were with, they've left. They are now alone somewhere out in the middle of the mountains. But they did not panic. They figured, you know what, we'll just make our way to the tram station and we'll either catch the next tram or, maybe there's a payphone or something up there we can use and, we'll figure it out. Now, it's important to mention that Brandon and Gina did not expect to spend very much time out in the elements. They expected to get on a tram, stay at the top of this tram station with a bunch of other tourists where there was a restaurant and a bar, and then they were going to ride that tram car back down and be back at their hotel before dinner time. As such, they didn't bring any supplies. They didn't even have their cell phones. They had left those in the hotel room because they wanted to make sure they were focused on each other. And so all they had were the clothes on their back, which were very light. They had tank tops and some sweatpants on. They each had a very light jacket as well. And they had a wallet and some chapstick. They had no water. They had no food. And so Brandon and Gina, they begin walking around in search of this tram station. And for several hours, despite their best efforts, they don't find it. And then before long, the sun is going down and the temperature is dropping rapidly. And so eventually, after it becomes too dark to continue to move around, the couple winds up going into a cave where they huddle up all night, barely avoiding becoming hypothermic. The next day, when the sun comes up, they haven't slept at all, they climb out of their cave, and they continue walking around the mountain in hopes they find this tram station. But eventually, they get to one of the higher points of the area they were in, and they have a pretty good vantage point around them, and when they start looking out, they don't see the tram station, they don't see anything but wilderness in all directions. And so they decided their best bet was just to walk straight down the mountain and try to just walk off the mountain. And they figured as they began walking down the mountain that the tour guide had probably recognized they were short 2 people the day before. And so certainly a search had been launched and there were people looking for them, and probably they would be found long before they ever had to actually walk off this mountain. But little did they know, their tour guide that had brought them onto the tram and then brought that group down, they had recognized they were short 2 people, but they assumed those 2 people must have just taken an earlier tram, and so nothing was reported. Nobody was looking for them. And so all day, Brandon and Gina made their way down this very steep mountain, falling half the time, smashing into rocks and trees, and getting cut up on manzanita bushes. It was just this awful experience. And by the time the sun was going down, they had no sense of how close they were to the bottom. They didn't have a good viewpoint. They were just kind of trapped inside of the wilderness. And so once again, they huddled up for the entire night. This time they didn't have a cave to protect them from the wind. And so it was just another absolutely miserable night. And so finally the sun comes up on the 3rd day, and Brandon and Gina, they're up and they are moving straight down this hill. They want to get out of there as soon as they can. And after smashing into more boulders and more trees and getting more banged up, they finally arrive at the same drop off down into a ravine in Long Valley that John had gotten to. And so they're standing over this ravine, debating whether they should make the leap and jump down into this ravine, even though it means they can't climb out again. And so they're looking around, they're figuring, you know what, we don't really have a better choice. We don't really have the energy to climb all the way up and try to go a different way. And we don't even know if those ways are more banged up. They finally arrive at the same drop off down into a ravine in Long Valley that John had gotten to. And so they're standing over this ravine, debating whether they should make the leap and jump down into this ravine, even though it means they can't climb out again. And so they're looking around, they're figuring, you know what, we don't really have a better choice. We don't really have the energy to climb all the way up and try to go a different way. And we don't even know if those ways are more advantageous. And so just like John, they turn around onto their stomachs, they grip the top of this drop off and then slip down into the ravine. Once they stand back up, they start walking down this ravine and they spot a river, and they run over to the river and they drink as much water as they possibly can. And it's a huge morale booster. And then they get back up again and they're continuing walking down the stream when off in the distance, they notice a green tarp strung up between trees. It was John's campsite. And so Brandon and Gina, they run over to this campsite and they eventually come across John's notes on the margins of his maps. But after standing up and yelling out for this owner to please come out here and help us, we need your help, we're lost, and then no one came out of the woods, no one heard them, no one responded, Brandon went back to the note and he looked at it again, and that's when he noticed it. The note had been written on May 8th. However, it had been written on May 8th, 2005. The year that Brandon and Gina were reading it was 2006. So this note was 1 year old. John had just happened to get lost and write a note on the exact same calendar day that Gina and Brandon arrived at his campsite and discovered the note. In their initial excitement and joy that they might get saved, they did not pick up on that year discrepancy. The couple began looking more closely at all of the gear underneath the tarp, and they noticed all of the metal objects like the forks and spoons and the pots and the pans, they were all starting to rust, and some of the other objects like the shoes looked like they had been sitting in the same spot for a really long time. They both started to get a really bad feeling about this campsite, like something terrible had happened there. Gina emptied the yellow backpack's contents onto the ground, and that's when they found a wallet. They opened it up and they pulled out an ID card, and it was John Donovan's ID card. So now they knew who had written the note and who owned this camp. Afterwards, Gina and Brandon laid out all of the maps to see if there were other messages that they had not read yet. And there were. There were 2 other additional messages after the May 8th message. On May 11th, John said he was celebrating his 60th birthday and that unfortunately he was down to his last 2 cheese crackers. And then in his final message on May 14th, John wrote, "Headed down to creek for water. Goodbye. Love you all." Devastated, the couple knew what they were reading were almost certainly John's last words, and his body was most likely somewhere around here. And then it dawned on the couple that if John, who seemed like an experienced hiker who had all this gear, if he had gotten trapped and died out here, then how did they stand any chance with no experience and no equipment? And so not knowing what else to do, Gina just rounded up all of John's things. She stuffed them into his yellow backpack, and then she shouldered the pack, and then she and Brandon just walked away from John's campsite and continued walking downhill, hoping that up ahead there was not going to be some gorge like John had mentioned in his May 8th note. But unfortunately, after walking for a little while, they reached that cliff with the 100-foot drop, with the waterfall going off the side of it, and they realized that they were trapped, same as John. There was nothing they could do. And so totally speechless and shocked, they just both sat down, they didn't look at each other, and they just sat there wondering what was going to happen next. And they both were thinking, this could be the place where I die. At some point, Gina kind of snapped out of her trance and she took John's backpack and she began rifling through it, pulling everything out all over again. And Brandon asked her, what are you doing? And she said, well, maybe there's something in here that we missed. Maybe there's a secret pocket or something in here that could help us. And so she rifles through this bag, and sure enough, she finds inside of a small pocket in the bottom of the bag was another bag, a little plastic bag, and inside of it were matches, and they were still dry. And so immediately the couple pull them out and they start to round up logs to try to make a fire. And as soon as they light it, it doesn't catch because all the logs in the area that were on the ground were wet from previous snowstorms and rainstorms. And so all night they tried lighting these fires, but they all just kind of smoldered out. And so eventually, after the sun went down, Gina and Brandon, who were totally disheartened, they went back up to John's campsite and they went under his tarp and they huddled together for another freezing cold night. The next morning, Brandon woke up because he actually did fall asleep, and Gina was still sleeping. And so Brandon decided to just leave the tarp and go out and get a breath of fresh air. He knew they were in a terrible position, but he just wanted to clear his head. So he stood up and he could barely stand. He was so achy and tired and he was so hungry, and he decided he would just walk down to the edge of this cliff and look out into the valley to see if maybe there was a way down. And so he walked along the river, stopping periodically to get a sip of water until he got to the very edge. And when he got there, he looked down and he saw something that he had not seen the day before. There, in a pool of water all the way down, 100 feet down, was a body lying face down in a pool of water. And that body belonged to John Donovan. Brandon was too far away to actually confirm if that really was John, but he instantly knew. But instead of being scared or saddened or depressed by the sight, it kind of invigorated Brandon and reminded him that if he doesn't act, he and Gina were going to die too. And so Brandon decided he wasn't going to set some small campfire to try to signal someone. He was going to try to light the entire forest on fire. And so he walked back up to the campsite and he got the matches out from the backpack, and then he walked into the forest a ways that was right near the river and near their campsite, and he found this tree that was obviously dead, and he walked around gathering as much dry wood as he could, and he propped it up against this dead tree, and then he put as much kindling as he possibly could into this hole in the trunk of this dead tree. And after doing all this prep work, he got his matches out and he lit some of the kindling, and to his surprise, the tree caught on fire almost immediately. In fact, it burned so quickly and so big that Brandon had to run away so that he didn't catch on fire. And before long, all these trees are catching on fire, and he had to run all the way back to the campsite and wake Gina up. And so he grabs Gina, they get up and they run all the way over to the edge of the waterfall, and they turn and they're just watching half an acre just completely erupt in flames. And all this black smoke is billowing up into the sky. And then about an hour later, after the fire had eventually just kind of died out on its own, Gina and Brandon heard the distant rumblings of a helicopter. They had seen the smoke and they were coming to rescue them. Gina and Brandon would be airlifted out of the ravine and would make full recoveries. John Donovan's body would be recovered 3 weeks later. His cause of death could not be determined. Some say that final note he left on May 14th, where he said he was going down to the creek to get water and then said, "Goodbye, I love you all," that was sort of a suicide note, that he actually threw himself off that cliff to end his suffering. Others say he just walked down to the edge of this waterfall and was trying to get a drink of water from the creek when he slipped and then fell over the edge to his death. But we'll never know for sure. What we do know for sure is that in 2005, when John Donovan was still alive and missing, had he been rescued, he would have left the valley with all of his supplies, including those matches, which would have meant in 2006, when Brandon and Gina found themselves in that ravine, there wouldn't have been a way to start that fire, and so they would have died. In fact, the helicopter pilot that did come up and rescue Brandon and Gina, he would say there was nobody planning to search that area. This was not an area they believed Brandon and Gina would be. And so it really was only because of that fire that those two lived. As such, the couple said they owe their lives entirely to John Donovan and his unbelievable sacrifice. On July 11th, 2006, a funeral was held for John in Virginia. 80 people showed up for it. Most of them were his hiking friends from his club. After the service was over, they all kind of poured out onto the cemetery lawn around John's gravesite. And as the bagpipes played Amazing Grace, Lynn Paget, the man who had done the first 100 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail with John before his feet swelled up and he had to leave, he walked around the crowd handing out red Solo cups filled with a tiny bit of John's favorite whiskey. And then after making sure all of the adults had their drinks, Lynn went to the head of his very good friend's grave and he delivered a beautiful eulogy. In it, he tells the crowd that he thinks of John all the time, he misses him terribly, and at night he has the same dream. He's walking down this trail next to a stream, and then the stream bends off to the side, and as soon as he walks around the bend, he sees this green tarp. He knows it's going to be John, and so he yells, "Hey comrade, hey comrade." And as he's walking over to the tarp, he realizes John isn't there. All it is a tarp, a pack, and some shoes on a rock. As for Brandon and Gina, they did stay a couple after the ordeal, but they would ultimately break up 2 years later. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the 5-star review button's bedroom and heat up both sides of their pillow right before they go to sleep. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we